Let's try that again now that I'm not muted. Hello, everybody. All right. So glad you guys are here today. By the way, I am Tom Hess. If you don't know, we are so glad you're here. And today we're going to talk about how to make guitar practice more fun. Because sometimes people get bored or they feel bored, either because maybe they feel like their progress is slow or they just don't really enjoy the process of practicing and they'd rather go and just play songs, etc. So we're going to talk about that. And I have a special guest here, someone I've known for a very long time, master guitar trainer, Mike Philippov. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Tom Hess. Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
All right, very good. If you guys hear an echo in the chat, just let us know in the chat. And before we get started, if you guys have questions about today's topic, go ahead and ask us in the chat. We are monitoring them, and we will try to get to your questions at the end. If your questions are sort of off topic or about other things, we're not going to really probably address those. But if it's on the topic of practicing and having more fun practicing, we'd love to get your questions answered. So, Mike, you coach a lot of guitar players from around the world on how to practice better so that they improve their guitar playing faster. And I'm sure that you've heard people say, especially people that you don't coach, say, I get bored practicing guitar, or practicing guitar is not as fun as it used to be, or I don't really practice guitar because it's boring. I just play. So why do you think so many people sometimes feel bored when they practice guitar? Well, I'll let you answer that question first, then I'll get to my second part of that question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think it starts with not having clarity on exactly what practicing is. Like as simple, as simplistic as it seems, like everybody thinks like it's an obvious type of thing, but it's really not. And I'll explain how I would define practicing in a second. So not being clear on that, that's the first part of it. The other part is not being clear on what type of fun you can really expect out of practicing. So the way I define practicing is just a process through which you either solve problems in your guitar playing or develop skills that make you the guitar player you want to be. Ultimately, those are basically the two reasons why you practice guitar. You could get more granular than that, but those are the main two. And then in that context, having fun while practicing, I think, boils down to just having a feeling of certainty that the things you're doing are helping you to either develop skills or solve problems that you have in your playing. Not necessarily in some groundbreaking breakthrough way where you like catapult yourself 10 levels as a guitar player after 30 minutes, not in that way, but feeling certain that even if you practice for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you know you're just that much better, that much closer to your goals. And I think in the absence of clarity on those two things, having fun while practicing starts to be really hard. So that's the way I think about it.
All right. Awesome. So, yes, I agree with that. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about what's causing, you already did, but if you can go a little deeper into what's causing people to feel bored. If you can go a little deeper into that, I think that might be good.
Sure.
What you said was great, but I know you've got more to say.
Yeah. So I think what causes people to feel bored beyond that is just the general sense of practicing being mindless, where practicing is something that people often think of practicing as something they just do with their hands. Like they have a set of, let's say, picking exercises or scale exercises, and they just move their fingers to play those up and down, but they don't have a sense of what purpose are these things solving, or what purpose are these things serving in my practicing, what problem are these things solving. And because of that, practicing becomes really boring really quickly, because how fun is it to just move your fingers up and down and move your pick up and down? Not only are you not getting better, but it's just a boring, monotonous sort of activity. So this mindless practicing is a big thing. And that leads to, as I mentioned earlier, this lack of visible progress where you can practice. If you try to be disciplined about it, if you think that practicing is supposed to be this thing you do where you are like a drill surgeon for yourself, you make yourself do it, but after a while, if you don't see the payoff, that of course robs you of any motivation to continue. So those are the things that make people feel bored when they practice, the big ones at least.
All right. So thank you for that. I agree on everything that you've said so far. Next set of questions here. Let's talk about the first thing that you mentioned. If you can take the first thing from your sort of a list here, what's behind this? What's the real root cause of that? So what's the root of the root here?
Right. So let's talk about mindless practicing first. I think the main thing that causes that is lack of, people define this in different ways. Some people call this intention. Some people call this deliberate practice. I like actually your definition, Tom, has something I heard you say, this idea of emotional connection to the things you are practicing. And I want to define what that is really quick, because I think people who are not familiar with this idea, they think, oh, emotional connection, I just got to do like more vibrato and string bends, but I'm sure that's not what you mean. There's more to it. I think that whatever you are practicing, even if it's like a rhythm guitar thing, some aggressive power chord, speed metal type of riff, the emotional connection to that comes from the desire to hear those notes or those riffs with a certain level of tightness, clarity, consistency, articulation. And when you hear it, it feels a certain way. It feels good. That is the emotional connection that you should be striving for. And not having that, in the absence of that, you are just repeating the notes on the page, reading the tab and hoping it's going to somehow get better. But if it doesn't, then you don't know what's going on. That's where the boredom comes from. Another example is if you're practicing some faster scale sequences where you might think I don't want to get into the debate of more emotional or less emotional, but the emotional connection in faster playing, again, comes from the desire to hear notes with a certain level of articulation, clarity, timing, having the hands feel in sync. Those are the things that create the emotional connection. And most people, I think, don't practice with that level of clarity. And that is why, that's where the boredom comes from a lot of times.
Yeah, good stuff there. I agree with what you're saying here, Mike, about the emotional connection. It's something that I've talked about with my students as well. And maybe it's something I could just add to this for those watching us, is that one of the things that I hear from students occasionally is when I talk about trying to connect more emotionally to what you're practicing. I think that they understand the words that I'm saying. They get the idea intellectually, but when it comes time to actually pick up the guitar and play, to really practice, they forget about it. They get lost in the technical details if they are focusing and paying attention consciously to what they're playing and not letting their brain go on autopilot. Mike, I think we might be getting a little echo here, by the way. I'm getting a little echo on my side. But the point is that if people don't enjoy the process, if you've got to get yourself to enjoy this process of practicing, and it's not that hard to do. Okay. So I think that when you're practicing something, if you play it and it's wrong, if you make a mistake or it's slow or it's not very clean or the phrasing isn't so good yet, that's okay. That's the purpose of practicing, to improve all of those things. But the thing that I advise students to do is don't wait until you're really, really good at something and then think, oh, I'll have fun doing this, or I'm good. I can really feel, the emotion of this lick or this technique or this phrase or whatever. Start with it now. So if you imagine a caveman who has no real language, there's no vocabulary, there's certainly no grammar of any kind. But all he can do is grunt and make noises and maybe scream or do something else. He, of course, is focused on and only on whatever he's thinking or feeling, probably in a pretty primal way. So it's all based on emotion when he's trying to communicate. And as cavemen and women became, a little bit more civilized and language started to form, um, it's still emotion or thought first, then expression. On practicing guitar, sometimes we reverse that process in our minds, where we focus on the words, the vocabulary, the equivalents in music, and are detached from the emotion. That this is just a mechanical exercise. And sometimes when we practice, we are doing mechanical things to perfect certain aspects of the lick, but you've got to let the caveman out. Let the, let the caveman out is what I'm saying. So, even as it's not yet perfect, or may not even be close to perfect, stay connected to that and just really feel what it feels like, what you're trying to do, what the sound you're trying to make, and where you're trying to go. So that's my 2 cents on that. All right. So earlier, Mike, you mentioned several things. We just talked about the first one, emotional connection. If you want to maybe talk about the second thing and what's the root cause of that, if you can expand further on that one.
Yeah. So the other thing I mentioned was, which is like the big thing people experience, is lack of visible progress. When they practice something over and over and the progress isn't there, it's easy to become discouraged, even if you are very motivated, and even if you do your best to do the things about emotional connection and have specific problems you're trying to solve. And the cause of that is simply lack of awareness of the fact that many skills on guitar don't develop they don't develop instantly, nor do they develop linearly. Meaning, instantly is like if I tell somebody, hold your pick this way, and you hold it this way, and all of a sudden playing feels easier. That's an instant thing. A linear thing is you're trying to get from 200 notes a minute to 1,000 notes a minute, and you go from 200 to 210. That's a linear progress. You're not at 1,000 yet, but you feel like you've gotten better. But then there's a third level, which is the sneakiest one of all, is what I call retroactive progress. And I got a funny story about that, because I experienced this when I was in college taking ear training classes, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Tom Hess, as well. Ear training is not something that develops either instantly or linearly. That's something that I struggled for the first like 3/4 of the semester. I was actually getting worse. I was practicing ear training for like 3 hours a day. I was going to my professor in office hours. I was like doing everything I could possibly think of to get better. But I not only was I not improving, I was going backwards. Got like a C on my first exam, got a D on the second one. So I was starting to really lose hope. But then towards the end of the semester, everything just seemed to click, and it was like I got bitten by the super spider in Spider-Man, and I went to sleep one night, woke up, I was Peter Parker, and I felt like somebody just installed ear training into my brain, and I could finally get it. And then I got like 96% on the final exam, and everything was a lot easier after that. So that taught me that, first of all, that this thing, the retroactive progress, exists. And this is something I talk about with my students a lot. Things like undoing bad habits, or learning things like finger independence in the fretting hand. Those are 2 big examples for technique, at least. Some of those things are going to get worse a little bit before they get better. And some of those you're going to keep practicing, but the progress is going to happen under the surface, and you're not going to feel like necessarily you're getting better. So you need to have first, a feeling of certainty that the things you're doing, like I mentioned at the very beginning, are the right things that are going to make you better. And you need to have some faith, some trust in the process, which is where having a good teacher or a good guitar practice trainer helps a lot as well. So that's another big thing that people overlook a lot of times.
Great stuff, Mike. What you call retroactive, what do you call it? Retroactive?
Retroactive progress, yeah.
Retroactive progress. Yeah, I've got a similar, slightly different, but similar view on this that I go through with my students here, especially when they're new. And I talk about the same things you talk about, that there are going to be some things that I can show you that when I show them to you, there's going to be an instant improvement, because it's usually a small thing. It's usually a small hinge that opens a big door. Okay. Most things are not, most guitar improvement progress doesn't happen that way, but there are some things that you can, and I can, immediately help a student immediately have a breakthrough. But then there are the other things, as you mentioned, the linear things where they're getting better over time. And then, the way I describe it to students is, imagine it like a sort of a winding path that loops around. I think Tommaso Zilio refers to this as a spiral. Okay, so you're here. This is where you're at, and this is where you want to be. And the path isn't really this way. I mean, the path of going forward is a straight line, but the method of practicing is that you might have a particular topic, a particular technique or something you're focusing on here. You're learning about, you're practicing, you're training. But in addition to this, you're working on this right now, but you'll have to do something else over here and something else over here and something else over here. By the time you come back to this over here, you're so much better, not simply because you practiced from here to there, but because these other things help or integrate. Oh, I didn't realize I'm off. I'm sorry, guys. Mike, you got to go away for a second here, buddy. My mistake. I didn't realize this was, I should have looked at myself on the camera. This is what I'm trying to say. You start here, and this is where you want to get to. So this is the topic you're working on, and then you are going to come back to this. But in the meantime, you're practicing something here and here and here, and these skills integrate with this one, so that when you come back to this original skill, you are now leapfrogging forward. This is different than practicing the same technique in a straight line where you make incremental gains over time. Okay. And this is something that people have a difficult time to see. Students sometimes don't understand the process. They'll say, well, you started teaching me this. You told me to practice this. And now you want me to go do this other thing over here. And they don't want to. They want to stay on this. Some students are this way. They want to stay on this, and they think, I'm going to stay on this until I get to here, and then I get to here and here. And they want to do this with the original thing you're showing them. And sometimes this is the path. But other times you're showing them other things, and then you show them how this integrates, and then they leapfrog forward. They have a big breakthrough. And it wasn't specifically because they practiced this only, but because these other aspects of playing leapfrog them forward. And then that happens again as you do other things over here, and now they leapfrog forward here. Now they're up here. So this way of learning is one of the ways that I teach, and I know that you do too, not exclusively these ways, but they certainly help, and they help a lot. So, okay, so getting back to Mr. Mike Philippov here. So now the next thing on the list that you promoted earlier, or you talked about earlier, what is the third thing, do you think? You mentioned emotion and music. You mentioned this retroactive guitar playing progress. Go deeper into the next piece.
Sure. The next piece is another big one, and that is just general lack of clarity on the problems you're trying to solve. And that comes from either not knowing what the problems themselves are, or what is the best way, or at least what is an acceptable way you might try to solve those problems. And I'll give you an example. I recently had a student who played something for me, and he said, I'm having a hard time with this lick. Here's the lick, here are the notes, here's the tab. How do I practice it? And my reaction is, I have no idea, but let's find out. Because just from looking at the notes, I have no idea how to tell somebody to practice it, because depending on the student struggling, let's assume I've got 5 people learning the same lick, and they're all going to struggle with different parts of the lick, and they're going to all struggle with different parts of the lick for completely different reasons, which is one of the reasons, by the way, I am generally opposed to simply prescribing general exercises for this skill or that skill, because it all depends on what is it that you're struggling with. But I don't want to get too sidetracked here. So getting back to the student, I told him, okay, let's find out exactly what you're struggling with. You play the lick, and you tell me which part of the lick where in the lick do you first begin to feel like there is a problem of some kind? What notes are the challenging notes? Is it in the picking hand, or is it in the fretting hand? And he tried it, and he said, okay, it's actually in my fretting hand when I make the position shift. I said, okay, so from here we can get more clear, and we say, okay, let's isolate the position shift, and let's look at what's happening right before the shift happens, what happens during the shift. And it was like some issue with his thumb, I think it was. So we fixed that. But my point is, it all started with asking deeper questions, going deeper into what the problem is, getting clarity on it. And the next level from there is using a little bit of intelligent trial and error. There's nothing wrong with trial and error as long as it's done intelligently and there's more trial than error. But it starts, this is the process that gives you the clarity, and the clarity then gives you feedback that tells you, okay, are you on the right track or are you completely on the wrong track? Because if you tried, let's say, the thumb thing for the position shifting, that hasn't worked at all. Okay, let's try something else. What else could it be? Those are the questions I often ask myself when I practice, and those are the questions that I teach my students to ask themselves when they practice. And I'm sure, Tom Hess, you've got a similar process for those types of things. But this clarity is super, super important.
Yeah, totally. All right. So now that we've, or you specifically, have identified reasons why people sometimes feel bored when they practice, and we've explored sort of the root causes behind all of that, or at least a lot of it, let's talk about what guitar players can do about it. Now, you've already expressed some of this already, but what other advice do you have for everyone to make their guitar playing less boring, more fun, beyond what you've already said?
Sure. Well, let's first revisit the goal, especially for those who maybe are tuning in a little bit late. As I explained in the very, very beginning, practicing is about solving problems and developing skills. And the fun that you can have in that context is feeling certain that you are getting better, even if it's a very small amount by the time you finish practicing compared to when you started practicing. So the first thing I would say is focus less on looking for just general exercises like speed exercises or scale exercises or sweep picking exercises, whatever. Those things, when people ask me for like exercises or licks, I know that they're going to probably have a hard time enjoying the process of practicing because they don't have the clarity that we talked about a moment ago. They don't really know what to focus on with those exercises. Focus instead on the problems you're trying to fix and the skills you're trying to develop. And from there, you can create your own exercises. So let me explain what I mean. Say, for example, you are trying to get better at your sweep picking. And let's get a little bit more specific, of course. That's not a clear enough problem. Let's say you're practicing A major 5-string arpeggio that's got the nasty 3-string roll that you have to do with the middle finger. Let's create exercises for that. I have a set of criteria for a great exercise. And a great exercise, in my view, needs to either isolate a problem you're trying to fix, it needs to either emphasize the problem, or it needs to exaggerate the problem. Isolate, emphasize, or exaggerate, or some combination of the three. So with the rolling thing, for instance, let me just quickly show you. Instead of just, well, the isolation part can be really simple. You just repeat it over and over in an isolated way. It's very simple, very basic, very rudimentary exercise, but it works. At least you're going to not be distracted by the other notes. To emphasize the arpeggio, you may want to, for example, play it just the lower two notes and the roll itself. So you're playing more than just the roll, but still focusing more on the roll. Exaggeration can come from moving it lower on the fretboard where the stretch is going to be a little bit harder and the demand for your fretting hand is going to be more difficult. Or it may be creating a little sequence out of the roll instead of just playing it up and down. So this way you are working on the problem, but you're creating your own drills that address the problem in multiple layers from multiple angles. And that's what not only makes the practice effective, but it helps you enjoy it because you're mentally engaged. You're getting more emotional connection to what you're doing. All these things we talked about start to come into play.
Very good. Okay, so Mike, we've got some questions here. I'll start with the Facebook ones first, and then we'll get to the YouTube ones because there are more on YouTube. And I apologize for the person who asked the question on Facebook. I cannot see your name in the system we are using, but the question is, do you recommend practicing one topic or several topics in your daily practice plan?
Okay. Generally speaking, it's obviously better to practice more than one thing. However, I think what this question is asking, not so much like what are the topics you might want to cover, but how many exercises should you, or things to practice, should you put into your practice schedule? And the reason I make this distinction is because you can take one exercise or one lick, say a scale sequence, and you can use it, just one exercise, to improve a number of different skill sets. For instance, you may practice a scale sequence and just work on your picking hand. Make your picking hand more efficient. Let's say you're working on directional picking, working on those string changes, make those nice and smooth. You may practice the same scale sequence and work on fretboard visualization and just memorize, using the same scale sequence, memorize the melodic minor scale, if that's, let's say, unfamiliar to you. You can practice the same scale sequence and work on your timing. Make sure that when you're playing, say 16th notes, the first note of every beat is lining up with the click. You may practice controlling some element of technique. You may practice creating variations on the basic scale sequence pattern. So again, the answer is you always want to work on multiple skills, but you don't have to necessarily need, you don't necessarily need a separate exercise or drill for those skills. You can just take, in fact, it's a good challenge to have for yourself when you practice. Take as few exercises as you can and try to improve as many skills as you possibly can with that small number of exercises. And that gets your brain engaged, makes practicing a whole lot less mindless, and makes it more fun, I think, along the way as well. What do you think about that, Tom Hess?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this. Actually, I was going to answer this question, or I would answer this question in a very similar way. Let me just add a little bit different perspective on it. It's not really different. It's just adding to what you've already said. So, and again, we don't know exactly how the question was intended to be asked, so we can interpret the question in different ways. But here's what I want you to imagine. I'm going to take the question and interpret it. Again, I'll restate the question again. The question was, do you recommend practicing one topic or several topics in your daily practice plan? Okay, so I'm going to interpret the word topic to mean, let's say, right hand technique or sweep picking, maybe left hand, or this could be something with the left hand. This could be something like two-hand synchronization. This could be improvisation. It doesn't matter. We have a whole list of possible areas or things we could practice. Okay, so now let's choose one. Okay, so we got 4 here. Let's choose one, and from here we can branch off into lots of different ways in which we can approach this topic, whatever that topic is. So if this topic was, let's say it was a particular lick, let's say, a particular technique. So we got 4 different techniques we could practice today, but maybe we're going to focus on one, okay? Now from this topic, this technique or this lick, we could focus on just the picking. We could focus on the economy of motion. We could focus on two-hand synchronization. We could focus on the phrasing. We could focus on just the vibrato or the intonation or just the timing. And Mike has sort of said some of these things already. So we're choosing one basic lick or technique, and we're approaching it that we're going to practice different elements or aspects of that technique. So it's one technique or one lick right now for today or for this practice session, but we're approaching it from many different angles. We can also take this and flip it upside down. Yes, we can. So now I want you to imagine that we are going to focus, let's say, on, let's reverse what these boxes mean. Okay, so these are no longer the topics. What we're going to do now is say that maybe this one is, let's say it's two-hand synchronization. So for two-hand synchronization, for two-hand synchronization. So here we're going to do the two-hand synchronization with this particular lick. Then we're going to focus on another minor piece of the two-hand synchronization with that same lick, etc. So you can subdivide two-hand synchronization smaller and smaller to be more fine aspects. Let me show you another way to use this chart. Let's say now that we want to focus on two-hand synchronization in general. Flip it back this way. So now the box is no longer topics or techniques, but practicing elements. Let's say two-hand synchronization. We'll stay with that. So now we have lick 1, lick 2, lick 3, lick 4, lick 5. now we're practicing licks, but just focusing on two-hand synchronization for this practice session, or just timing for this practice session with different licks. We're not approaching the same lick from different aspects. We're taking one aspect and applying it to different techniques or items. Okay, so you can look at it either way or reverse what the boxes mean. Okay, and this is a very crude, simple example. If I was doing this in a training session, I would actually add another layer to this and it'd be a whole nother layer over here. But just to give you the principle of the idea, that's one way that question could be answered and approached. Okay, let's take another question here, also from Facebook. Let's see. Do you need to do a lot of warm-up exercises every day? Mike?
Right, yeah, that's an interesting question, and I know you got a lot to say about this topic, Tom Hess. Here's my philosophy on this. The answer is no. You definitely don't need a lot of warm-up exercises. One, because of what we just talked about. You can take anything you practice and warm up your brain, warm up your hands in a variety of different ways with just playing the same notes, just simply varying what you are focusing on. That's a big lesson in and of itself. The second thing is the best warm-up exercises are the ones that, at least in my view, are the ones that you're going to be practicing for the meat and potatoes of your actual practice session. Just simply play them slowly enough so that your hands have time to warm up, the blood has time to become thinner in your hands and so on, especially now as we get into the colder months here. And also another great thing to do is to focus on something you ordinarily wouldn't focus on, something that challenges your brain while your hands are warming up, where your hands are the limiting factor. You can't play as fast as you want, but your brain has almost an infinite capacity to focus on some of the things that Tom Hess was just talking about. You can focus on two-hand synchronization in a little bit of a different way. You can take your main exercises and just transpose them to another key or another mode, create different scale sequencing patterns, change the rhythm, just change something about them so that your brain is engaged. You're learning more, you're learning the guitar, you're developing a variety of your skills as you're warming up, and then as your fingers warm up and you're able to play faster, then you can move on to just seamlessly move into your actual practice session. And with that, you don't have to waste any time doing a whole bunch of random exercises that are not serving any purpose other than to just thinning the blood on your fingers. And so you're making your practice time more efficient, and from there it just becomes more effective as well and more fun as well. So what do you have to say about that, Tom Hess? And I know you've got more to say on this thing.
Well, you said pretty much most of the stuff I would have said. So basically, you took the words out of my mouth. That was really good. The main thing I'll just reemphasize is that let me back up one level. I think that the questions like this, do you need to do a lot of warm-up exercises every day? That question may have been asked from the perspective of, do you need to do this to avoid injury? Or do you need to do this warm-up exercises? Sorry, I guess I was muted. Was I muted for very long? Did you hear what I said, Mike?
Just for like a second, you cut out. You
great.
started asking about you started talking about different.
I must have hit a key. All right. So the point is, the question could have been asked from the perspective: do you need to warm up in order to play your best? Do you need to warm up in order to avoid an injury? What reason for warming up? And I think that sometimes when people ask the question, it may come from a place of like, what might be really being asked here is, do I really have to do this boring, mindless stuff before I can get into the good stuff? And I think you've kind of already addressed that, Mike, that when warming up, use that time to learn. So, for example, if you have a particular set of chords or a particular set of modes or something that it's not totally unfamiliar, but you don't have it totally memorized, or you don't have it totally under your fingers yet, so you cannot play it fast because you simply don't know it well enough to play it fast yet. Those can make good warm-up exercises because your brain has to think, because you're not able to play it on autopilot yet. So you want your brain, just as Mike said, you want your brain to stay engaged in the process, not go on autopilot and do mindless finger exercises. You might be warming up your hands, but you're wasting a lot of practice time when you could be using that practice time, that warm-up time, to warm up your hands and improve on the guitar. See, the alternative is you use the warm-up time to warm up your hands and don't improve on the guitar. I know which one I would choose. I would rather warm up my hands and get better somehow than my hands and be no better than I was 20 minutes ago. So that's what I have to say on that. Mike, we got another question here. This one from YouTube, and Krish, if I'm pronouncing your name right, says, so is it redundant for me to make a practice routine consisting of different picking and fretting exercises? Mike.
Sure. Well, if we take into account everything Tom Hess especially drew out a few moments ago, generally I would say the answer is yes, but it doesn't have to be. So sometimes having different exercises is good if, let me say it like this. I was going to say it's good when they're all different, but there is value to having exercises that are only slightly different. I'm actually going to talk about that right now. There is something I teach that I have as a complex name, but it's actually a really simple thing. I call this context expanding variations. What that is when you're practicing something over and over and your brain, despite your best efforts to stay focused, starts to go on autopilot. So this is when having a slight variation of the main exercise you're practicing, something as slight as changing from the neck pickup to the bridge pickup, or moving it to a different key from A major to D major, or something like that, is going to trigger your brain to snap out of the mindless practicing trap you started to fall into, and now you've reset your concentration. You're able to focus a little bit better, even though nothing really changed about, fundamentally, nothing really changed about what you're practicing. It's still mostly the same thing. Or you can vary like the articulation of how you're doing something. That's another way to just expand the context. At the same time, if you are going to have multiple exercises, multiple picking exercises, multiple fretting hand exercises, it's good to practice them, practice things that are different, so that you get to practice, let's say, for example, one exercise that's just more linear, moving up and down the scale, another one that uses some string skipping, so that you are training different areas of your playing. And ultimately, what it boils down to is the most important word, I think, in all of guitar practice is the word context and specificity. It's kind of hard to give general advice, like blanket prescription, always do this, never do this. I mean, there's some things that are like that, but most of the time it's not that way. We need to look at the context of exactly what we're talking about, and from there make a general prescription. But if I were to distill my answer down to something a little bit more actionable you can take away with is, you can do both as long as there is a clear reason and a clear intention behind what you're trying to achieve in that given practice session. So that, I think that's the best way to sum it up.
Totally agree. I think you answered it very, very, very well. One thing I'll just say, or maybe restate from what you said, Mike, is that the question is basically asking about, is it redundant using multiple picking or fretting hand exercises? And I really like what Mike said about making variations or using different ones to keep your brain from going on autopilot. Whenever you make a change, your brain has to think about it. And that is when you are going to improve the most. When your brain has to think, that's when you make the most improvement. When your brain goes on autopilot, it might feel better, but you are not. You are not getting better because new neural pathways are not being really solidified. You're just firing the old ones. Okay. You're not really improving, or at least not much. When your brain has to think, improvement goes way up. Okay. And this is just neuroscience. This is not me talking. It's not my opinion. I didn't just make this up. Okay. So let's see. I've got a couple of questions here. I think I can answer myself really super quick. Here is one. Totally agree with that emotional connection that Mike was talking about earlier. That being said, on a daily routine, routine practice, when is it okay to stop the practice session? Never. It's never okay to stop practicing. You must practice forever. There is no end for you. There's no end for Mike. There's no end. I'm joking. I don't know how to answer that. It depends on if you've got to go to work or something, I suppose. But in general, the goal is you want to have a specific, tiny little goal. Mike calls them micro goals, micro practice goals for that practice session. If you go to your guitar, you pick it up and you say, I'm going to practice now. The chance of you getting better is small. It's not zero, but it's small. If you have a very specific little micro goal, as Mike Philippov talks about, then you now know exactly what you're trying to target. Not only are you more likely to improve, but you're more likely to know that you have improved. And that is key. Because if you practice and you don't know that you've gotten any better, that doesn't exactly make you feel more motivated to keep going or do it again tomorrow. But if you know, yep, I had this tiny little target and I hit that target, as tiny as it is, that builds momentum and that builds motivation and it makes you a player. So I think we'll just leave it at that. But in general, no, you're not allowed ever to stop practicing. Let's see here. Question for you. I'll let you take this one, Mike. This is from Wayne. Thanks, Wayne, for asking your question. Could you elaborate on cycling through practice using circuit training? Well, we've both talked about this. Take this one, Mike.
Sure. Yeah, so this is quite similar to the idea of context expanding variations, where you simply plan out in advance different drills or different ways to focus on the same drill or same exercise that are going to challenge different aspects of your playing. A perfect time when this comes into play is in the area of endurance. So that's just, of course, one example. There could be many more. Let's say you're working on legato and you're practicing some legato lick and your fretting hand becomes tired, but you want to keep practicing. You want to still build some more endurance in your fretting hand. Well, what you don't want to do is you don't want to stop and just rest if you don't absolutely have to, unless, of course, you're feeling pain. If you're feeling like sharp stabs of pain, that's a separate issue. Of course, you must stop immediately, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just general burning sensation of fatigue where you can still play through, but it's uncomfortable. One thing you can do in the circuit training is to just shift your focus on the same lick to some other aspect of it. Like, for example, you can stop doing legato and just pick every note. Or you may even do double picking on the lick. So your fretting hand is still moving. It is still training, even though it's not hammer-ons and pull-ups in that moment. It's just fretted notes. So the work is much less. It has time to rest while you are training your picking hand. In sports, they have, I believe it's called fartlek. I believe it's a Swedish word. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Where you're alternating sprints with jogging. You're basically like jogging for a certain distance, then you're doing a short sprint, then you go back to jogging. It's kind of the same thing with the circuit training example. So you're practicing the same thing, but you're varying what you're focusing on and even what you're doing. And this way you can go for quite a long time. And you could potentially do this for 30 minutes or more with one exercise and not only not get bored and avoid injury, but you're also going to train multiple areas of your technique and of your just general awareness of guitar. That's also going to make everything a lot more fun. So that's one way you can do it. Another thing, if we're trying to step away from just the technique aspect or the hand fatigue aspect, is you can make a list in advance of what are the elements that you're going to focus on with the exercise. And you can set a timer to go off every minute to remind yourself it's time to switch now. And let's say you're practicing the scale sequence. For 1 minute, you're just focusing on maximum speed with it, for example, trying to play it as fast as possible. After a minute, you need to move it to a different mode, and you practice transposing the same scale sequence to a different mode. Then after a minute of that, you're just trying to expand it to other areas of the fretboard. Then after a minute, you do something else. So this way, it's just another example of how you can create circuits that you basically pre-plan in advance. It can be an entire practice session if you want it to be. You can do this for 45 minutes, an hour very easily. And this way you can keep yourself engaged, never get bored, and get quite a lot done, even if you got very little time to practice. So Tom Hess, do you have any other thoughts on this?
I do. Again, as usual, I agree with everything that you said here. The couple points that I would add is, and Mike, you alluded to this. I don't think you said it explicitly, but if you did, you just said it briefly. But one of the benefits of doing this is it forces your brain to stay engaged. And again, as I talked about earlier, touched on it before, is that when your brain is engaged and it has to be consciously thinking about what's happening, even if it's something that you can do well already, that's when you're going to make the most improvement. It's not going to be when your brain's on autopilot. So by going through and going through either different items or practicing different aspects of the same item, like we talked about here, and looping this, and especially if you ran and don't always do it in the same order, that forces your brain to not go on autopilot. And that is so incredibly helpful in order to make improvement. And the other thing is that when you interleave, when you practice something, or you practice some aspect of something, and then you go to something else, either a different item or a different aspect or different element of that item, and then you go to something else. When you come back to this, your brain has to go back and retrieve the information in order to execute that same item with that same element in the same way. When I say your brain has to go and retrieve the information, I don't mean that you forgot what you were doing and you have to think, okay, what was that lick again? And what was I doing? I don't mean that. I mean that you think of your brain is like a massive filing cabinet, and it now goes and has to find all the information and assemble them in order to execute anything, to do anything. Okay, well, every time that your brain has to go retrieve that information, it is neural pathways in your brain that required to execute that stronger, because it's building a material around that neural pathway called myelin. Myelin is a white, milky biological substance that goes around the neural pathway, kind of like insulation on a copper wire. Okay, so if you on your mobile phone charger, there's probably in there, that is what the electricity is shooting through, and then so you don't get electrocuted, there's the insulation around. Okay, well, that's very similar to how our brains work. You have neural pathways that you develop when trying to execute an action or remember something, and then there's the myelin coating around it, which keeps the integrity of it strong so that the signal doesn't dissipate and then cause inaccuracies or no motions. So that will help. Getting a little nerdy here, but that helps that myelin material grow and remain strong, which is what makes you a better guitar player every single time. But that development of that myelin only really happens when your brain is consciously thinking. When you go on autopilot, you're firing electricity you're firing the impulse through the neural pathway, but the myelin is not really getting any better. It doesn't decay because the neuron's being fired, so that's good, but it's not really strengthening the myelin, which is what makes your technique even better, or technique or memory of knowledge or whatever it is. So, all right, very good. Now, next question here. This one's from Facebook. I'll read it to you, Mike. It says, if I just transcribe solos and songs and experiment with the learned vocabulary while jamming, is that not sufficient enough to become a virtuoso eventually?
Well, there are quite a few terms we would need to define, like, for example, how long is eventually? But in general, The answer is, of course, no. There's a lot of things that go into becoming a virtuoso, and no single thing is this. There's no secret. There's no one secret that you could just flip a switch and become a virtuoso. Because if there was, everybody would be doing it, and Tom Hess and I would be out of business probably. But as far as transcribing songs and solos, I don't think it's the best use of time. It's the best use of your practice time to do that, with a few exceptions. Let me first explain why. Transcribing songs and solos are not exercises that somebody created with intention that somebody somewhere is going to use them to improve a variety of skills. Songs and solos were created, one, around the desire to just play something that sounds good. And this is really important. This is something I heard from Tommaso Zilio, actually. He gets full credit for this idea, but this is super profound. They're based around the limitations of whoever created the music. So don't think that just because you're learning an Yngwie Malmsteen solo, you're learning to play like Yngwie. You're not, because of everything I just said. And secondly, if you want to benefit from studying the music of somebody and use that to improve your own musical skills and knowledge, it's best to do this just by analyzing what is happening without necessarily sinking in the weeks and weeks of time needed to just learn something through rote memorization and get the solos up to speed and so on. You can get like 99% of the benefit of analyzing a John Petrucci solo just by understanding, okay, what's happening in the solo? What is he doing here musically, technically? What are the techniques he is using? How is he connecting all those things? And then if you really, really want to learn like one lick in the solo that's really cool, sure, learn it by all means. But that's like the 1% versus the 99% that's actually training your skills, training your musical awareness, getting outside the scope of technique here. That's going to eventually lead to you becoming a virtuoso. But simply just learning from tab and learning the notes is a very low return on time invested in terms of practicing, at least the way most people do it. And I definitely don't agree, but like some people say, that learning songs is like helping you become a better musician or songwriter, because like I said, for all these reasons, it's really not the case in most cases. What do you think about that, Tom Hess?
Again, I sound like a broken record here. I agree, and I agree totally. I think that when you are looking at, you mentioned Yngwie Malmsteen as an example, but this is true for any guitar player, any guitar player that you like or would like to emulate or whatever. When you are listening to their songs or their guitar solos or whatever, and you're trying to emulate that, what you are hearing or maybe seeing is the result of something. Okay, it is the result of all of the skills, or at least a big portion of the skills that they have had to develop, and practicing routines and techniques that you can't see. Even if you're looking at a video and it's in slow motion and it's up close, there are some things you can definitely see. There are other things you cannot see, or at least you cannot see. You definitely can't see them if you don't know what to look for. You just can't see it all. Okay, so there are many things you can see that are obvious or semi-obvious, or if you know what to look for. But there are other things you won't see. You didn't see all the work that went behind that. And what you really want is not simply to copy the product. You want to copy a process that was used to acquire and then integrate those skills that you are hearing among your favorite guitar players. Okay. Now, even with that, even here, let's look at it this way. Here's what you really want. Okay. You need two things. Well, you need three things. We're using Yngwie as the example. First thing you need access to Yngwie. Okay. So you need him in the same room with you. Okay. Now, don't bother asking me any questions, because I'm not sure he's going to give you the answers you want to hear, or even if he's going to consciously know how to articulate them. That's not an insult to Yngwie Malmsteen or anything. I'm just saying that a lot of his skills, I would assume, he probably takes for granted and hasn't needed to ever break them down into tiny component parts for the last 40 years to teach them to somebody else. That's my point. Okay, so we're going to take Yngwie and we're going to, there's Yngwie's head. Here's his neck, here's his head. Okay, there he is. We shaved his head now. All right. Now, what you want after you have access to Yngwie is you want to cut a hole in his skull and put a piece of glass here so you can look inside his brain and see what's going on there. Of course, I'm being funny here, but this is a metaphor. As a metaphor, this is what you want. You want to be able to look inside there and know and see the things that are not visible when you watch him play. Okay, through his memories, through his practice routines, through what he's thinking about, or more importantly, what he's not thinking about, because he's automated in his mind. All of those things are what you want to see. And then you would need, the third thing is a time machine to go back 40 years to see how he developed the way that he did the skills he has. But even if you had all of that, you had access to Yngwie, you had a window into his brain and you could read it. And even if you had a time machine to go all the way back, you would be able to copy the process of one guy, one person. And as great as he is, there are other guitar players who do things differently, which may be a little better in some aspect, okay? Or maybe more efficient, meaning that if you copied everything that Yngwie does, or we could take John Petrucci or Steve Vai or whatever your favorite guitar player is, the chance of them doing things in the most efficient way when they were learning is zero. I mean, on all aspects of guitar playing, okay, it's zero. Okay, nobody instinctively does everything perfect and has the most efficient process from the beginning. That's why you have different ways of holding the pick, different ways of picking, different ways of doing various techniques. Okay, so what would be better is to be able to take the process I just showed you and multiply that times many people. Well, this is impossible. We can't read people's brains. We can't see what they're thinking about. We don't know exactly what's automatized, and we certainly can't go back in time. So we have problems in order to break things down. That's why Mike and I do what we do. No, I'm not Yngwie Malmsteen, and Mike isn't Steve Vai. Mike is Mike Philippov. Okay, but the point is that this is what we specialize in. We're not the only ones, but we specialize in this. Those guys specialize in writing songs and playing cool solos and doing what they do, and that's fantastic, and that's great, and they are great at doing all of that. But our job is to simulate the process I just laid out. Okay, that this is what we do all day, every day. Okay, so we can take things which either appear to be complicated, but they're really not, or sometimes things that are complicated and break them down into simple pieces so that anyone can learn them. Anyone can do them. You can follow them. And if you do them, if you follow them and you follow them in the right order and the way he or I or whoever tells you to do it, you're going to go very far. So this is what we do. And this is what we studied. So that's really what you can do that on your own. Incredible amount of work and amount of trial and error, or you can learn from someone who's already done that work for several decades and teaches it to other people. But getting back to your original question, and I'll restate it. If I just want to transcribe solos and songs and experiment with the learned vocabulary while jamming, is that not sufficient enough to become a virtuoso eventually? No, it's not. Of course it's not. Now, if you're thinking, well, wait a minute, but I know this person and that's what he did, and look at him, he's really great. He did a lot more than just watch and copy. There's more to it than maybe perhaps what you can see. So I'm not suggesting that every great guitar player had taken lessons for 30 years and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's a lot that goes into it that is beyond the surface. That's the point. All right, Mike, I think that we are a bit out of time. It is 2:00 Chicago time. I want to thank you, Mike, for hanging out here today, as well as everyone being here. And before we take off, Mike, you have something, I believe, that you have available for people to check out.
Yes, I do. So it's a video masterclass called Guitar Speed Formula. And what it is, it's a very simple process you can do in like 15 minutes per day to build guitar speed from wherever it currently is at to a higher level without having to start slow and gradually increase speed in small increments like everybody tells you to do. But if you've tried it, you probably know it doesn't often work nearly as well as people tell you that it does. Well, this is a new way to build speed. You probably have not tried yet, and it's free. I'm going to show you how to do it all in detail, so you can check it out at this link and enjoy.
All right, very cool. I also have something here, Mike, for everybody. This is also free. You can totally just download it instantly. There's nothing to buy here. You can just get it. Okay, it's free. And this is the 4 pillars of. I'm sorry. This is a Guitar Mastery Decoded. Sorry about that. And there are basically 4 pillars of guitar mastery that let almost anyone play guitar as well as they want. It takes work. There's work involved. This is not magic or fairy potion, but if you follow stuff, it will really help you, give you a big head start on mastering things. So there's 4 steps for worry-free guitar progress as predictable as your next inhale and exhale. That means if you follow these things and you do them, they're going to work. If you don't follow them, or you follow them only sometimes, or you kind of cherry pick here and there, the results are going to be mixed. Okay. So the point is that there are a set of principles, foundational principles, fundamentals that lead anyone to being able to master any aspect of guitar playing. Okay. This is just a fact. Okay. It's not a mystery. Becoming a good guitar player or even a great guitar player. Your favorite guitar players, they didn't, despite what they may want you to think, they weren't born that way. Okay. Yngwie himself says he dropped out of high school and practiced guitar 8 hours a day every day for years and years. So you don't have to do that. But the point is that this is not about being born with special gifts or being some kind of freak of nature. This is not about that. There's a set of principles. If you do these principles, you're going to get better. And if you continue doing those principles, you're going to get even better. And it's just going to be like that. Okay. You may need help along the way. You may have questions along the way, but this will get you started. It's totally free. Download your copy. All right. Thank you, everybody who asked questions. We had a lot of good questions today. And for everyone who checked us out live and those who are going to watch the recording. Thank you, Mike, for hanging out here and spending your time with us and sharing wisdom. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care.